Okay, in our final MacIntyre lecture on his lecture, the Aquinas lecture of 1990, we'll finish with his discussion of what he says is the non-Thomistic method of dealing with non-Thomistic conclusions in metaphysics and inquiry in general. And well, what MacIntyre basically says is you have to use their weapons against them. The weapon of the genealogist is not to sort of deal with people's claims straight out, try to adjudicate them using reason, but is a sense in which you analyze the history, the origin, the sociological context, the economic structure, the cultural conditions and restrictions, all these things that kind of like represent the context out of which a viewpoint comes. This is sort of begun in earnest with Nietzsche, especially in one of his early lectures on truth and lie. Uh, that's a very good beginning of a genealogical inquiry, where he talks about the origin. He says, why do we have this drive for truth? Is it really a drive for truth, or is it something else? This is the beginning of his will to power uh, paradigm for all language and claims to truth. So MacIntyre says that the genealogical narrative has the function not of arguing with, but of disclosing something about the beliefs, presuppositions, and activities of some class of persons. It provides a subversive history. Well, what MacIntyre is saying is that the contemporary philosophy, both in its analytic and deconstructive modes, are first of all best understood, he says, as a consequence of the rejection of Aristotelian Thomistic teleology at the threshold of the modern world. And what he argues here is that this rejection of teleology is really what's at heart of their system. And of course, if you do that, then an Aristotelian Thomistic notion of first principles as the telos, as the end of inquiry, become illusory, impossible, or just unintelligible. Now, this is a wonderful analysis here he gives of the Rortys and the Derridas of the contemporary world. But just to sum it up, what he basically argues here is that they do not accomplish what they set out to do. They do not end up divesting themselves completely from a teleological mode of inquiry. They have to tell a story about what they're doing. There has to be a sense in which there's progression from less to more awareness, knowledge, truth even. Regardless of how you construe the meaning of those things, there's a stable identity, at least, of an inquirer. There's a sense in which certain viewpoints are discarded and others accepted. You see this even in pragmatism, right? Although there's no such thing as mind-independent truth anymore, everything is a certain mode of action, there's still a criterion that is being used here to adjudicate more or less relevant or interesting viewpoints. Utility, social, political, cultural utility. There's a sense in which one could say that is or is not the best criteria for the use of language. You see, and whether or not statements are useful or a certain grounding for use of statements is based on utility and it's coherent. All this is still within the Aristotelian teleological mode of trying to come up with some understanding of a first principle, even if it's a first principle that no longer accepts that there can be correspondence of our language, our thoughts, with the real, because everything's the number 17. So I'll read a little bit of MacIntyre here. He says, where the Thomist sees stages in a movement away from adequate conceptions of truth and rationality, stages in a decline, the protagonist of the dominant standpoint in contemporary philosophy will see stages in an ascent of movement towards. But the problem is, towards what? And of course, that's the question. If there's some kind of descent or ascent, right? I mean, as if you make a distinction between ascending or descending conceptions of truth and rationality, then there has to be some telos that one is looking at to define and discriminate between whether or not one is going forward or not. So the bottom line here is the deconstructionists and the pragmatists are not what they say they are. They do not achieve their project. They still have vestiges of that which they would divest themselves completely if they could. In other words, they're Aristotelian Thomist in denial, in the fact that their mode of inquiry, regardless how non-academic or regardless of what language they choose to use, how much they try to move away from the Platonic legacy of essentialism and presence, as Derrida says, they still retain some kind of story structure in their mode of inquiry. So that doesn't mean that their position is wrong and Thomistic position is right. It's just one very serious flaw and one reason to discount their claim that the Thomistic Aristotelian notion of inquiry and in metaphysics is sort of outdated or an illusion or just something to be discarded. No. The fact that they don't succeed in escaping from the very framework which a Thomist would say is ineluctable in one's reasoning, the framework of a teleological mode of inquiry, the very fact that they can't escape it is actually, prima facie at least, evidence for the superiority of the Thomistic Aristotelian tradition. Okay, well that completes our lectures on MacIntyre's Aquinas, 1990 Aquinas lecture. First Principles, Final Ends, and Contemporary Philosophical Issues. Thank you for listening. And I hope to see your comments in the text box for Holy Apostles students.